broadcasting from the Unshackled studios in Melbourne. This is WilmsFront, brought to you by the Unshackled.net. Now here's Tim Wilms.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to WilmsFront on this Wednesday, the 17th of February, 2021. We are live on the WilmsFront YouTube and DLive channels, as well as on the YouTube and DLive enhanced entropy software, where throughout the show you can ask me and my guests questions and also send through a super chat as well to support the show. It is currently 8:30 p.m. here in Melbourne, where in 3.5 hours' time, Victoria will be coming out of this horrid 5-day snap lockdown on time after the Holiday Inn hotel quarantine leak cluster looks to be contained with 0 cases today out of 40,000 tests. After midnight tonight, there will be a 9-day easing period with limits of 5 visitors to your home per day and limits of 20 to outdoor gatherings. Masks will remain in indoor settings, but all other COVID summer rules, including those for business, will be the same. From midnight tonight, you can also flee to New South Wales if you are fearful, I would say quite rightly, of another potential snap lockdown for Victoria, and Queensland will open its border to Greater Melbourne at the end of this easing period, beginning at midnight on Saturday, the February 27th. My Trad Tasman Talk co-host, Dewey DeBoer, his city of Auckland will come out of its snap 3-day alert level 3 lockdown from midnight New Zealand time, which is in 1.5 hours, as Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern announced this afternoon that she feels confident that they've traced and isolated all contacts from a mystery cluster likely linked to their hotel quarantine program. Now, apologies for cancelling the scheduled Sunday night special. I promised that was going to feature Joel Jamal returning to the show. The snap lockdown was a factor in that cancellation, but Joel will be my guest on the next Wednesday edition of WilmsFront at this same time. During the past year, the alternative media, which myself and the Unshackled are a part of, have been more important than ever. When the history is written about this dark period in 21st century history, where we've seen horrific levels of government tyranny all around the world, our reporting, commentary, and conversation will stand as a permanent record to counter the narrative the mainstream historians will attempt to write. My guest tonight is one such person who is providing the other perspective during this era of historical uncertainty and volatility. Damian Coory has had an extensive career in the public relations sector and the mainstream media. He's worked in AM radio for over a decade, including for ABC Radio Queensland and 4BC. He currently hosts the Otherside podcast, and which is now a vodcast, which is syndicated on both the Good Sauce and Discernible networks. Damien, welcome to the show.
Hey, Tim. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Now, you're a Brisbanean, but you're not in Brisbane at the moment because you were in Melbourne at the end of last week. You got out of Victoria before the midnight lockdown came into effect to New South Wales, but you've had to settle at the north coast of New South Wales since your premier has always been border closure trigger happy.
Certainly has. It's it's a pretty crazy situation. So I was in Melbourne for a couple of meetings with Matthew Wong of Discernible, the platform that I'm working with at the moment to produce the Otherside Australia, and Matt and I managed to have a meeting, do an interview, have dinner, and then I went back to my hotel and woke up the next morning to the news that the state was going to go into a lockdown, possibly, and didn't waste any time getting myself a car and hitting the road. So my weekend in Melbourne came to an abrupt end, and I'm now in northern New South Wales, staying at a friend's place. Just waiting to see if my state will open its border and let me in. It's astounding to me that I can come into New South Wales from Victoria but I can't go into Queensland without doing 14 days in government quarantine at my own expense. I just find that utterly ridiculous. And this is the world we're living in now. We have limited freedom.
Yes, it's still incredibly sad and also distressing as well. I mean, you can't go back to your own home in Brisbane. You're in you call it temporary accommodation while you learn to see if you're allowed back into your home state. Even though, as I said in my introduction, New South Wales feels confident enough to open up to Victoria at midnight tonight, but your Chief Health Officer, Dr. Jeanette Young, wants to wait 9 more days.
Well, she's the Chief Health Officer. Her focus is people's health, as it should be. But the Premier is the one who's supposed to make the decisions. And in a crisis situation, my expertise in PR is in crisis management. And in a crisis situation, what's supposed to happen is the leader is supposed to take advice from all of their senior advisors. And of course, every senior advisor that has a specialty is going to be biased to their own specialty. The lawyers are going to be looking to manage risk from a legal perspective. The PR people are going to be looking at managing risk from a reputation perspective. And you're going to have, probably in this situation like this, you're going to have medical people that want to be managing risk from a medical perspective. What a real leader does is they bring all of that together. They assess all of that information, and their job is to look at the bigger picture, to say, okay, what other things could go wrong? What other things could happen beyond outside what my specialists are telling me? For example, how much suffering and pain and death and misery and bankruptcy and livelihoods are going to be destroyed by the lockdown itself, by the remedy itself. In Queensland, we don't have a leader. We don't have someone doing that. We have a woman who says, I just do whatever the health officer tells me to do. Well, that's an abdication of her responsibility as the Premier of Queensland, and it's unacceptable. And the opposition of Queensland is, I believe, also failing to call her out on it properly.
Oh, it's the same with our Premier, Dan Andrews, who says we always rely on the public health advice, which he seems to elude. He always talks about the public health team, which I don't think his Chief Health Officer, Brett Sutton, is actually one of the main decision makers, because we've found out through the horror of 2020 just how many decisions weren't his. So I guess you could call them the faceless health advisors. We never see them because the health advice is kept secret, but that's what makes Dan make the decisions.
Yeah, well, this is one of the problems. I'm sorry if you can hear the rain. It's just started to absolutely bucket down. It's been like that all day here. I'm in northern New South Wales, and we get like 30 minutes of sunshine, then 30 minutes of the cyclonic rain pouring down. It's beautiful, though. I think it's pretty crazy state of affairs in Australia generally that we seem to have. You hear this expression, the deep state. It's not that deep, right? It's just the first layer of bureaucrats that are not listening to the ministers. And the ministers are the elected leaders. They're elected by the public. They're supposed to be the ones that set policy. And then the director generals who run the departments, the career bureaucrats, are supposed to implement the policy based on what the ministers tell them to do, because the ministers are elected by us. But instead, in practice nowadays, what seems to happen in Australian politics is the bureaucrats just go along running everything. And then when the government changes, they kind of go, well, you're here for a few years, buddy, but, we're going to be here a lot longer than you. So we'll just kind of work around you in this sort of a yes minister, yes prime minister sort of style. And it's not working.
Yeah, the Westminster system is more yes minister than a US-style deep state.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. I don't know anything much about the US. I think they have the same issues. What I saw in the Trump impeachment trial last year was anything to go by, but certainly the State Department believe that they should run, things the way they want to and not listen necessarily to the directive of the president. But I digress. it was interesting to hear Bronwyn Bishop last week. I think she was on Sky News talking about this very issue and just saying that when she was a minister, she basically said, you've just got to go in there on day one and say to the Director General of the department that, you expect accountability on everything. No decisions are to be made without your awareness, and force them to be accountable and provide those briefings to you every single day and remind them every single day who is boss. The boss is the people, and the people, the people's representative is the elected member of parliament who has become the minister to oversee that particular government department. So I see the problem. I see problems in Australian politics, but I see real problems in the power hunger, perhaps, or the way that the Australian bureaucracy is being run. We need a reset on that big time.
Now, even though you don't know when you'll be able to go to your home in Brisbane, at least you avoided the house arrest here in Victoria for the past 5 days. You were able to go outside without a mask for however long you wanted to go for a walk or go for a coffee or go shopping. Unfortunately, Lee Sales, host of 7:30, was not so lucky. She got trapped here in Melbourne because she came down on the Friday for a friend's birthday party, and so she's been hosting 7:30 from the Melbourne studio. She tried to get Dan for an interview, but he declined, so she went to his Daily Dan press conference and asked him the quite reasonable question: how is this a proportionate response, this circuit breaker lockdown over a small cluster, even if it is the super strain? And of course, you're quite active on Twitter. The Dan stands, as they're known. They're basically like, how dare you? We want you out as 7:30 host. We want Laura Tingle to be the host. They treated.
I have my views about the Dan stands. I'm not sure that they're all real. I think there is a public relations firm behind them. I won't name which one I think it is, but I've asked repeatedly for some confirmation or denial from that PR firm about whether they're behind all of this, particularly a Twitter account under the name PR Guy 17.
Yes, that's become quite a prominent spinning account.
Yeah.
It lives up to its name.
Actually, terrible PR, by the way, from a professional perspective. I can assure you. But anyway, enough said.
But it's like the way they piled on her, the Dan stands. It's like it was a question coming from Rachel Baxendale or Peter Credlin. And well, I guess it's somewhat refreshing that Lee Sales managed to upset them so much, given that she is the ABC's preeminent TV presenter. But it just goes to show you our ABC, there's certain types of people who think it's only theirs.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest proof of the bias of the ABC is the shock and awe with which those on the left who watch the ABC regularly react anytime there's a conservative or a conservative viewpoint, or even a classical liberal or libertarian viewpoint expressed. It's so jarring because it's so not what you are used to seeing on the ABC that they take a front and they think that their perception is that the bias is actually now going the other way because they've lost their little happy place, I guess, their little echo chamber, $1 billion echo chamber. I think, it's an extraordinary state of affairs in the Victorian parliamentary press gallery as well. When I was many, many moons ago a young reporter at 3AW, I did a stint in the press gallery, and at no stage back then would we have been quite so passive towards or pally with the Premier. You have to maintain a certain amount of professional distance. And I haven't seen that. The vibe in those press conferences is very chummy, friendly. So it's not a professional environment at the moment, in my humble opinion. And I think the fact that poor old Rachel Baxendale gets criticised for being, and she's actually the only person in the room that I can see that's really doing their job. There may be others, but I haven't watched that closely. But I've certainly been quite appalled by how slack they generally seem to be. But Rachel's done a fantastic job. And of course, she gets slammed on Twitter for it. Peter Credlin had to go in and show them how it was done. She did an incredible series of exposés on that whole fiasco. And now we've got Lee Sales, who, I guess, an ABC reporter, a left-wing leaning sort of network. And she's being criticised now by the left on Twitter. So it seems that anybody who puts challenge to question or challenges Dan is immediately going to be attacked. Not that, being attacked on Twitter is a big problem. It's par for the course and a bit of a waste of time, really. But, it doesn't speak well for the state of our media. And I don't think it speaks well for the credibility of the press gallery in the Victorian State Parliament.
What I've noticed with the mainstream media ever since the pandemic began on Australia's doorstep is that they were, because the mainstream media up to that point had been dying, they went into total 24/7 fear, like the newspapers every day, the radio, the television news reports on the 7 and 9 news. And as we've seen with all the polls and the recent local elections, such as in your state of Queensland, when as I called a border closure trigger happy Anastasia Palaszczuk, she trumpeted her at times very cruel border closure. She got re-elected comfortably. How much can this be attributed to the hysteria or in fear that the mainstream media has propagated over the past year? Because we're talking about the Melbourne Press Gallery before. For months leading up to the second hard, horrific lockdown, they were egging Dan on so much that you've got to lock down, you've got to crack down more on these COVIDiots. And obviously you talked about the relationship between them. Of course, the media is a medium between the public and the politician. And so a politician is always going to take a lot of cues from the media as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It is there's a symbiotic relationship there, and you're absolutely right. I mean, if the media is putting pressure on Andrews to do X, then he obviously is going to follow that. In Queensland, we just had the ridiculous situation of the re-election of Premier Palaszczuk on the basis, despite all the debt, all the problems with youth crime, all of the other issues that we've got in Queensland, the Jackie Trad issues, allegations of all sorts of problems and even corruption within the government. It really is concerning that the people have been, and this is something that I've sort of been trying to understand, is why is everybody so compliant in Queensland and Victoria and Western Australia in particular, just so happy to go along with this? And it's really got to do with fear and the fact that most people are not impacted terribly much. People who have to travel, who've got relatives overseas, people who are working interstate, get themselves trapped like I am, and I can't go and see my own children. I can't go back to my own home. I mean, I lived in Asia for 20 years. I've never had that kind of restriction placed on my liberty or freedom. It's utterly absurd. Now, I wouldn't mind if there was a genuine risk and this was proportional response to a genuine risk. But what we're seeing here is just politics and bad crisis management by incompetent bureaucrats who are a little bit drunk on power, I think, and their political masters. It's interesting, Tim, there was on the other side this week, we're discussing a new academic paper that was written by a few economists and a social scientist from Europe, talking about this idea of there being a sort of a public mass hysteria. Just to give you the numbers, do you know how many COVID cases we have in hospital right now?
As far as I'm aware, there's just the nebulator man in Melbourne in the ICU ward.
Right. So there's 12 in hospital. Nebulator Man might be the only one in the ICU ward. When I last checked, it was 0 in ICU wards, but 12 in hospital. So we don't have, very serious cases of COVID yet. We haven't had a death nationwide for almost 2 months. And the 7-day rolling average death toll has been 0 for almost 4 months. And if you go right back to when the pandemic began, the number of people under the age of 70 who've died from coronavirus in Australia is 58. And the number of people under 80 is 216. Now, it's not to say that every one of those lives lost isn't a tragedy. It's very sad. And as are all the lives over 80 that have been cut short by this. But you don't have the luxury of being all emotional when you're a leader. You've got to weigh up, sometimes quite coldly, the facts and make decisions. Otherwise, you'll cause more death and more problems by the solution that you introduce. And, 20,000 people die every year in Australia from Alzheimer's disease and dementia. I think the numbers are similar for heart disease and stroke. Cancer, I think, is about 10,000. And the flu, the regular flu, is usually about 3,000 to 4,000. So, when you put these numbers into perspective, it's the response is simply not proportional. Now, you could say, look, we've had such low numbers because of the measures that we've taken. But there's just no evidence to support that. One of the main reasons Australia's had low COVID numbers is not because of all the crazy government responses. It's because we've got a very big country. We're isolated from the rest of the world, and we've got 26 million people spread over a very, very large area.
And we're warm. We're a warm country.
Yeah, and it's a warm country. Exactly. So there are a number of factors why we haven't had the sort of outbreaks that they've had in New York City, Los Angeles, and London, where you've got, these cities have got massive international traffic going through them at all times. So, it's a bit rich to say, oh, they saved us or they kept us safe, when really we could have achieved the same ends, having more of a Gladys Berejiklian type approach of not overreacting, but just doing managing the clusters one by one, doing a sensible response and not shutting down our entire economies. And it's not just, this is the other thing that bugs me so much is when people say, oh, all you care about is the economy, you don't care about people. The economy is people, right? The economy is the productivity of our nation that provides the resources that our nation needs to deliver healthcare and to deliver education and to ensure there's well-being in our community and to deliver good aged care and disability care and all of those things. We can't do that if we're broke. So this idea that you divorce the economy is like this evil money stuff and then everything else is nice, cuddly, fluffy stuff is this childish sort of worldview that I think if we don't shift it in Australia, we're going to end up broke. We're going to end up with a lot of suffering and pain. And probably a lot of indirect deaths from becoming a real nanny state and a real welfare state.
Well, having a drink at the pub with your mates, that's economic activity. So is dancing at a nightclub and a wedding as well. It's a lot of the economy is also social interaction between other human beings because humans are social creatures. We always have been.
Yeah, and I mean that's part of life, right? I mean, you saw some elderly protesters. I think it was in the UK or the United States that were holding placards and having a protest saying, what's the point of living if I can't see my relatives and have engagement? I can be a prisoner till the day I die. How about you listen to what we want and treat us as adults? Now, this is the thing I think Australian politicians have got to understand. Is the infantilizing, treating people like they're children and making Australians, look up to them like they're school principals or parents. Daddy Dan taking care of us all. Daddy Dan takes away our freedom, but Daddy Dan gives it back. So Daddy's nice today. I love Daddy. That kind of mentality, which parallels the abuse mentality. Is pretty prevalent, I think, in our society, and it really worries me. It doesn't happen overnight. I went away for 20 years and came back. So I've kind of had I've missed the boiling frog effect, where you kind of, you see the gradual change. I've come back and gone, whoa, this place is really different now. We've gone from a country, I think as one of my Twitter followers, who's really quite terrific, said the other night on Twitter, we've gone from a nation of people with grit to a nanny state of people who, really just want to be looked after and just want to be taken care of by the government. It's a welfare state sort of mentality. And that doesn't happen overnight. That takes a while to bring in, but we seem to be there.
In beginning in the late period of 2020, we saw the beginning of these snap circuit breaker lockdowns. First, it was Adelaide in November. Then there was obviously the one in your city of Brisbane. There was the one in Perth, and now it's us Victorians and the residents of Auckland who've had to suffer through the latest ones. You mentioned Gladys Berejiklian. She's definitely the least worst, though she did lock down the Northern Beaches local government area for around about 2 weeks. But you're right in the fact that the public are supportive of these highly disruptive and human rights abusive lockdowns, whether it be 5 days. They say, well, 5 days is better than 5 months. It was certainly the 5-day circuit breaker action, as Dan called it, was certainly harder for a lot of Victorians than it would have been for Brisbaneans and those in Perth, because we had that 112 days of hard lockdown there, and it certainly brought up a lot of the trauma that we all went through during that time, where we just felt that we had no hope. And I wasn't surprised to hear on the Saturday, the first day of the lockdown, that Lifeline had the biggest spike in its history in calls, the mental health helpline.
Yeah, I mean, I was only in the city for 12 hours, but I could really feel a palpable difference between Melbourne and Brisbane. Just the feeling in the city, and I'm someone who's lived in Melbourne and loves Melbourne, and it's just so sad. It was so sad coming in and just seeing that and getting that vibe. I don't know if it's possible for a city to suffer depression, but I think that's sort of what it felt like. It felt like the whole place was down, just generally down in the dumps. So yeah, to go through that again, I can't imagine what that would be like, and as you say, it does brings back all that trauma from your bigger lockdown. It's amazing. We've tested 13.5 million, or there've been 13.5 million tests, so half the population pretty much has been tested. And these tests cost $100 a pop. So that's a heck of a lot of money to be sort of tossing away there at a time when we don't have a lot of money. And out of all of those tests, we've got 29,000 positives. And the vast majority of them, as Alan Jones keeps saying, have had a mild illness or no symptoms at all. I think we'll probably stop testing now. It doesn't seem, and this idea that, if you look at Dan's press conference the other day from a PR perspective, when he announced the shutdown on Friday, very smooth stuff. He's a master operator of the spin and the storyline and looking reasonable. He does this thing I call looking reasonable, the reasonable guy act, where he's kind of, hi, I'm Mr. Reasonable.
Yeah, and his statements are exactly the same.
Yeah, and then you listen to what he's saying, and I thought, okay, he set this up beautifully. He's set up the fact that, this is a really scary, super virulent strain, and we've got to shut down to stop this strain, and it could just rip through the community so quick. And that's just, and then you realize afterwards, oh, actually, I just fact checked that, and it's a complete lie. It's 40% more infectious. Well, that means that, if you were going to infect, if you go into a room with 1,000 people and you were going to infect 11 of them with the old strain, well, now you'll infect 14 or 15. It's like, okay, so, how many of them are going to get sick and die as a result of being infected. It's the risk is there, but it's not. You can't just go, oh, we've got a risk. Someone could die of something. Let's just have a massive overreaction. And I know people keep saying, look, yes, but you can't look at the numbers we've got, the low numbers we've got, and say, therefore, we shouldn't be reacting this way. We have to look at England. We have to look at, Italy and the United States, where it was mismanaged. But we're at a very different stage of the game now. We understand a lot more. There are treatment protocols. The death rates are nowhere near what they were originally as a proportion of the infection rates. The thing has to run its course. That's the other thing. I mean, what's going to happen when we open up to the rest of the world? We can't stay closed forever. Almost 1 million Australians live abroad and work abroad. We export executive talent. That's one of our biggest exports. And, these people come home, there's no jobs for them. They're going to be draining on the community. We need people overseas working and making good money and buying assets back here in Australia. And that the value of having those Aussies overseas, I mean, is enormous to our country. And when I was an expat, it was like, you know that you can always go home. It doesn't matter how bad things get in whatever country you happen to be in or living in or visiting for work. You know that Australia is home and you always have a place there and you can always get back there. Well, that whole idea now has just been shattered. There are hundreds of thousands of Australians overseas that want to come home for a visit, that want to, and they can't even think about it because even the ones who want to come home and live again can't get home. So it's pretty frightening to think that we're doing that, but it's understandable in that the real threat we've got is from abroad, right? But why haven't we already built fantastic quarantine centres out in the bush on mine sites by the airports and things like that? Why wasn't that done straight away? I remember saying in the first week, it's a bit odd that we're, virtually sticking people inside vertical cruise ships, in the middle of our cities, hotels that, have air conditioning that's shared. And if you want to get coronavirus in Australia, get yourself into a quarantine hotel. That's why I won't go back to Queensland. There's no way I'd do that.
Well, we've seen Dan announce yesterday that he's looking at setting up a quarantine camp at Avalon Airport, which is in between Melbourne and Geelong. The same people who built the Howard Springs quarantine camp, they say they can get it up in 4 months. Now, obviously, Victoria with our second wave, it was everything that could go wrong with hotel quarantine did. That's why it was so bad. But as we've seen, there's been leaks in all other major cities. But you're exactly right. It's a year on, and it's still. And I'm beginning to think that Scott Morrison just seems to have just abdicated everything to the states and just so shrugs his shoulders at these proposals that the states have for federal quarantine facilities. And I think that's because he's scared, probably of the Queensland election result when he'd been campaigning against border closures, and border closures won the Queensland election. And that's why he's rolled over and said, yep, all these snap lockdowns are fine, because he sees they're popular. So I've noticed that Scott Morrison in 2021 is just rolling over at the federal level, not wanting to do much.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, these camps going up now just sounds Orwellian and creepy, right? But
I know.
If they a year ago, it would have been like, good, okay, that's a sensible thing to do. Why have them in the city? Get everybody out, have them well run. 2 weeks in there, you're out, you're done. Now it's sort of like, oh, they're building camps. It's like it makes you think, oh, what are they up to? But it is the only way to go. We've got to permit Aussies to come home from overseas. I've got relatives overseas I need to go and see, elderly parents-in-law and things like that. I mean, a lot of Australians do. And you've got to be able to get back. And there has to be a way to do that at a cost-effective way that doesn't, restrict your liberty and freedom. So yeah, it's the only way to go. It would be nice if they had maintained our trust, treated us like adults from the beginning, and then the community would have more trust in the government. And they wouldn't have to, right from the start, they were throwing these massive fines and doing the heavy-handed policing that we saw in Victoria, and the huge fines. I mean, Dan, I think, was the first one with the $1,600 on-the-spot fines. I mean, $160, a tenth of that is a deterrent for most people. I mean, you don't need to go around fining people $1,652. It's just insane. And that's not how you build trust in a crisis. As a leader in a crisis, you're supposed to try to build people's trust, build the community's trust, get them on side, get everybody working together. No, none of that. I'll just punish you right from the get-go and treat you like children. And if you disobey me, you're a naughty school. I mean, this is the sort of mentality we've got. And it is coming out of one side of politics. It's coming out of the Labor side. There is no question. I mean, I try to be, I'm not a Labor supporter, obviously, but I try to be a little bit fair and neutral as much as I possibly can. But this is an infection in the mindset of the left. It's that new authoritarian left that's putting so many people off. Now, ScoMo, it's a whole other story. It really started in the Queensland election with Deb Frecklington, the Liberal leader in Queensland, who just, was too scared to basically say anything other than that she would, keep the borders closed. So that went well for her. So let's reproduce that and do exactly the same thing in the Western Australian election and lose that one too, shall we? It's not a winning scenario. And I think ScoMo, look, I don't know. I mean, I don't have connections. I don't really know what's going on at a federal level. But just as an outsider looking in, I would say it looks like ScoMo he's a marketing guy, right? We know that about him. That's his background. So he'll be research driven, right? So he'll be getting all this party research that says, the people want the closure, the people like the closure, the people this, the people that, and so he'll respond to that. Now, market research is good to know what people currently think, but managers look at market research and do what market research says. Leaders lead. Leaders, like Steve Jobs once said, how can you do market research on the iPhone when it hadn't even been invented yet? People don't know how can they know they don't want something they don't even know what exists, So, or how can they know they want something that doesn't exist yet? Which is sort of saying that, you've got to lead sometimes. So a real leader from the conservative side of politics would be out there saying, we need balance, we need proportion, we need to be sensible, and most of all, we need to stop the absurdity of having different rules from different states. I'm sorry. The idea that he doesn't have the authority and power to do this is contested. And certainly in the environment we're living in now, it's one of not so much do we have the legal right to do this, but let's just do it and see if we can get away with it, right? And you've got Dan's ridiculous laws and he was trying to put through the omnibus bill and all of that stuff.
Authorized officers.
And the closure of borders. I mean, even that is questionable, right? So just do it, ScoMo. Just take the leadership and say to the states, I'm sorry, but you're not allowed to close the borders. We're a federation. We're a free people with free movement, and we are one country. We are not 6 separate countries, okay? We're supposed to be a federation. And we're supposed to act as one nation. Now, I know there's states' rights and all that sort of stuff, but that doesn't extend to free movement within our territories. I'm sorry. It's fundamental to Australians of our generation that we can move around Australia freely. And I know that might result in transmission. So have zones around like they did in northern beaches of Sydney. But to shut state borders, arbitrary lines that exist for political reasons, that's not okay. And to have a situation like the one I'm in, and believe me, I'm not suffering. I'm missing my kids. That's the suffering. And that infuriates me. I don't like having my liberty deprived and all of that stuff, but I'm not suffering in terms of, the financial way that some people are suffering. So I don't want to overstate it, but it is a little bit ridiculous that, I can be here in New South Wales. I did 5 days of relative isolation, and I'm good to go. But I can't go to Queensland, my home state, go home, see my family, see my kids, unless I go into some kind of lockdown. Now, that level of inconsistency between the states is the responsibility of the federal government. The federal government is responsible for ensuring that we operate and function as a nation. And what is this expensive national cabinet garbage for if they're not going to have some degree of alignment in strategy come out of that national cabinet? It's ridiculous. So, yes, I do think what we're seeing now is Scott Morrison, a prime minister that is also not living up to his responsibility as a leader. And I think he thinks that the clever way to go is to stay that middle path and try to appease everybody and not be too controversial, because that's what the market research is telling him. And I think it's an extremely dangerous and foolish strategy. And the reason it's a dangerous and foolish strategy is there does come a point, and there's evidence to prove this, that people will reject a leader who appears to be weak and sitting on the fence and doesn't state clearly where they're coming from. People will accept people who disagree with them, and the evidence is crystal clear on this from research in psychology and neuroscience and political science from the United States. I have the data on this. People will accept people who have ideas that they don't agree with if they respect that person and they say, hey, I don't agree with you on that, but I generally like the way you're leading things and the way you're doing things, and I know where you stand. What people don't like is they don't like people where they don't know where they stand. So I'm afraid that the marketing-led approach, or the marketing research-led approach that we're seeing from Scott Morrison, in my view and in my professional opinion, will backfire on him. And he'll be seen as weak again, and it'll be the second time in a major crisis he's been seen as weak. So I'd be thinking long and hard about the strategy if I was advising the Prime Minister at the moment.
I've become acquainted with, over the course of the pandemic, a lot of people from the Albury-Wodonga twin cities, which obviously Albury, New South Wales, Wodonga, Victoria, who have been divided for a lot of the past year, and were divided again over this 5 days. And you talk about the inconsistency of rules. Obviously, if Wodonga residents were under house arrest, only allowed within 5 kilometres of their home, had to wear masks everywhere, but just across the Murray in Albury, no mask mandate anywhere. You're allowed 50 people over at your private residence, allowed to leave the home for any reason. And from tomorrow, in Wodonga, masks all indoors, only 5 people at your private home, 20 outdoor gatherings. And I just mentioned what it is in Wodonga. Why is the virus so much more dangerous in Wodonga that it needs so many restrictions, but not in Albury?
Yeah, it's bureaucracy. This is what happens when bureaucrats run a country. So if you want this sort of madness, bigger government, that's how you'll get it. It's the same in Coolangatta Tweed Heads. I was down there for quite a while over the summer holidays, and on one side of the road you can do one thing, and the other side of the road it's another. It's utterly ludicrous. I mean, these arbitrary lines, these arbitrary state borders, I mean, they exist for a reason. We have states' rights, I get that, but we're supposed to be one nation. That's what federation was for. And crossing the border, the freedom to cross borders and the freedom to engage in trade across borders and all of that is supposed to be enshrined in our Constitution in the spirit of Section 92. And there are other sections as well of the Constitution that speak to this sense of sort of freedom that's supposed to be allowed, and the authority of the federal government. The federal government can introduce laws that override any corresponding or conflicting law within a state. So ultimately, even though the Constitution, this is where the counter argument is that the Constitution demarcates clearly what the feds can do and what the states can do, and that health is a state responsibility to a large extent, I think is the main reason for this. But there are constitutional lawyers that I've interviewed on the show who've said that this is not clear, and certainly the federal government could exercise, could have a valid argument and a valid case that would need to be tested maybe in the High Court, but they could raise a fairly strong case that they have the right to do this. But just in the real political environment, you could do it. You could just do it. And then, everyone else is just doing stuff and not worrying about the Constitution too much. So why can't ScoMo and the federal government just do it? Say that this is what you expect, demand it, and use other means of leverage, like funding and money, to make the states toe the line on it.
The pre-coronavirus, the most peculiar thing about Coolangatta tweets heads was the hour time difference during summer. The fact that on one side of the street it was a hour later, the other side. It just shows how much the world's changed. And as you alluded to earlier in the interview, you lived in Asia for 20 years. You are used to traveling all around the world. There is some limited international travel, but Australia is, and New Zealand is as well, still a fortress where, well, it's not just hard for residents and citizens to get back in, but you're banned under the Biosecurity Act from actually leaving the country unless you have a special exemption. And the same with coming in. You're allowed in if you're playing sport or filming a movie. But this is where I think, now that we're in 2021, I've been watching a lot of the international news. We're in a situation in Australia now where one case can shut down a city for 3 to 5 days. Obviously, the UK is going through a prolonged lockdown, but they're not aiming for elimination of the virus. They're going for basically a mixture of enough vaccinations and also obviously containing, you would say, tracking and tracing as well. But this is where I think Australia's success story is going to unravel. If it just takes one case, then all the other nations around the world, they're not going to be, if everyone's vaccinated, well, the vaccination is a whole other topic, which we'll get into, but just for this situation, if it's tolerable for, say, a city of London to have 20 cases a day, because they're comfortable that there's enough herd immunity there, how is Australia going to get out of this rut where it's one case, panic, hit the panic button, lockdown again?
Yeah, well, it's impossible, right? It's an unsustainable approach, and that's why it's flawed. The notion is that, we'll get everybody vaccinated, then we can start gradually opening everything up again. If we can just hold out until we get everybody vaccinated, everything will be great. I'm not sure that's going to be the case. I think herd immunity levels will mean that, yes, we're probably going to get over it. And we will then be able to open up internationally a little bit more, but we're going to have to be able to tolerate more illness and death than we've had, I think, as a society. We just have to accept that viruses are a part of life and death, a part of the way things operate, and that you can't, walk around in a plastic bubble for the rest of your life in fear of getting a bad flu. It's tragic, it's sad, it's horrible, and I certainly don't want to get it, and I'll do anything. I'll wear a mask. I've got no problem with masks. I've got no problem with taking every precaution in the book. But I do have a big problem with deprivation of civil liberties and human rights and fundamental freedom of movement, and governments overstretching their power. And it just isn't sustainable. Well, we don't have a political party in this country at the moment, Tim, that's advocating for that, major political party. We've got a number of small ones emerging, and I think the major political parties are going to feel the pain, particularly the conservative, liberal and national parties will feel the consequences of this, because there are a lot of cranky conservatives and classical liberals like me running around the country right now that are not very happy about the way things are being managed from either side of the mainstream political spectrum. The problem, of course, is that we enable this. The people of Australia enable this. And one of the things that I, as somebody who sort of observes country, one of the things that I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. I mean, what is going on in terms of the psyche of Australia that we think that all this is okay? there was a new paper published this week in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health called COVID-19 and the Political Economy of Mass Hysteria. It was written by two European economists and one social scientist, I said earlier. And it argues that media and government, by repeatedly sort of driving negative messages, have created a kind of collective hysteria, and that hysteria has led to big policy errors by governments. And the really interesting thing about the paper is that it says that if you are a sort of a nanny state or a welfare state or like a big government, socialist or semi-socialist sort of country, that this phenomenon will be much stronger than it would be in a small government, more liberal country, liberal in the classical sense, of course, or libertarian country, because in those countries, people have a much higher demand or have a much higher respect for the principles of, freedom of movement, freedom of association, family values, and the family is the core unit of the society, and also the right to own property ownership. So those fundamental principles tend to mitigate the mass hysteria effect because it keeps the government kind of in check. So I thought that was really interesting. That in countries like Australia, it becomes much more self-reinforcing, and especially when those negative messages coming every day at you from authoritative sources, and those authoritative sources are being amplified by a media that doesn't question. We've had very one-sided, shut down kind of approach to commentary on this. Even Professor Clancy with his comments about hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin that were amplified by Craig Kelly MP, and then Craig Kelly MP getting shut down by Ali Langdon on the Today Show. Did you see that interview?
Yes, I did, where she's basically like, well, I don't want to talk about the issues. I just know that you're wrong and you're dangerous and just wanted to berate him. And well,
pull your head in. Pull your head in. You should pull your head in. And
Craig Kelly is currently gagged at the moment, not by the Prime Minister, but by Facebook. He's got a 7-day Facebook ban. But you're exactly right talking about the political, I call it the political media complex, which feeds into the population with all this circulating now. But it's now probably the political mainstream media and social media complex. And we saw that with the pile on Craig Kelly, where it came from obviously the mainstream media such as the Today Show, Tanya Plibersek, and all the Labor front benches slamming Craig Kelly. And then we see Facebook as well constantly restricting his account. And because they're all feeding each other, so much hysteria and fake news and slander about Craig Kelly was accepted as fact, that he was an anti-vaxxer spreading misinformation, conspiracy theories. Not true at all. Nobody, of course, goes to the source. There was, of course, that I think the probably what made it hit fever pitch was his podcast appearance with Pete Evans. I listened to it and I thought it was quite a reasoned, interesting discussion. I'm not sure if you listened to it, but it was another case of, I haven't seen it, but that sounds crazy. That was the sort of the mainstream media reaction to that podcast.
Yeah, but I mean, look, this is how the sort of the mind of, and this is where it's really dangerous, right? Because you get this kind of, I call it the cool kids effect, right? So you just get the inner city clusters of, and it's not just, I'm not picking on millennials here because it's Generation X as well. It's my generation as well, and the boomers, and maybe even the Zoomers. Although I think the Zoomers are going to give Generation Y and the millennials a run for their money in years to come, which is going to be fun to watch. But we're all guilty of having a segment of our community that are, no matter what age group it is, that are kind of shallow in the way that they look into things. And it's normal that human beings want shortcuts to make sense of the world, right? We don't have infinite time to do research. I'm a bit of a nerd and I get online, I look all these things up and I waste so much time doing it that I think, I should start a podcast because, I'm spending so much time doing this anyway. I might as well make something of it. But, a lot of people just don't have the time, mate. I never had the time. And so what do? You're sitting at home and you kind of hear, oh yeah, that bloke, yeah, he must be a bit of a jerk, and he was on that other podcast with that bloke who's a bit of a jerk and a bit of a conservative, and so it's like, he's on, and it's all this guilt by association, and then
yes,
you just get this pathetic sort of shallow hysteria reputation thing happening, and nobody goes back to the original thing and says, well, hang on a minute, let's just listen to what the guy's got to say. At the extreme of that phenomenon is Trump derangement syndrome, right? Donald Trump, not the most smooth sort of, styled sort of leader, and certainly not a member of the US elite classes, but a guy who's got a lot to offer, a bit of a gung-ho sort of person, but he's uncouth in some ways. He's different. He's an unusual looking fellow, I guess, in some ways. And you just kind of, it's like, well, why? I mean, you've probably asked, left-wing friends and centrist friends who don't like Donald Trump why they don't like Donald Trump. I very rarely get policy as an answer. I usually just get, he's sexist, he's racist.
There's
characters, right?
I've still come across people who are not politically active who just automatically accept that as a fact that Trump is racist, sexist, homophobic. Yeah.
And that's part of what I guess you've got to manage as a public figure, but it's exhausting these days because, there's so much, it's so quick on social media, the pile-on. I mean, I've had many pile-ons, and I'm sure one day doing a podcast that's not left-wing and doesn't toe the conventional line, I'm sure I'll get piled on in a much more serious way. And I guess if you're not my age and you need a job and you're young and you're starting out in your career and your reputation matters a lot more to you, your public reputation, then that can be really, really, really damaging. So I think it causes a lot of us to be quiet. Now, I would just say to anybody who's sort of semi-retired or retired or my age or over, have a think about what you can do to contribute to the public discourse. And if you're a conservative or you're a classical liberal and you care about the country and you care about the way this woke culture is taking us, it's time to stop being the quiet Australians, because the younger equivalents of us can't speak out because they need a job. And there's an incredible force going on right now in the corporate world through the HR industry, to push this postmodernist sort of
and to take Twitter complaints about their corporation as that, oh my God, we're going to lose heaps of customers.
Right, exactly. Instead of realizing that if they overreact, they could also lose heaps of customers. But yeah, you've got this real force in to shut up, right? So people are censoring themselves because they need to keep their jobs, and there's no tolerance for an intolerance of, some of these ideas that are being sprouted. So those of us who are older and those of us who are sort of further on in our life journey, and we probably are not so dependent upon other people for our livelihoods, we need to speak out. We need to stop being quiet Australians and be very noisy Australians. And that's part of what's driven me to do the podcast, because I think, it's just not okay, the situation that we're in at the moment. And we need to have voices out there quite loudly saying that this stuff has got to stop, and it's got to stop soon, or we're going to end up a vassal state of China, really, eventually.
Or just a decadent welfare state if we keep going the way that the way we are.
That will lead to poverty, because we won't have productivity. And it will lead to us being controlled by external states. So you can't just kind of be a quiet, closed, welfare state. Someone will come in to manipulate you from the outside, and that player is pretty clear right now who that is and which country has got its eye on doing that. And so, we're heading down a much more dangerous path than a lot of Australians realise. Now, I admit I've been skewed because I just lived through the destruction of Hong Kong by mainland China, but now it's tragic. It's really sad. We've got the Hong Kong equivalent of Rupert Murdoch has been carted off to jail. We've got all these young protesters that led the protest movement that are all being arrested and taken across the border and sham trial. I mean, it's terrifying, really terrifying stuff that we haven't really seen on this scale since Mao Zedong passed away. So Xi Jinping is a very different president to the ones we've had previous to this and after Mao, who really wanted to reform and open up to the West, and we extended our hand of friendship to them. And now we're suffering the consequences of perhaps being a little too trusting in that regard.
We only have, you would say, in Australia, one non-leftist mainstream media corporation, which is News Corp Australia, and the media establishment, the social media users, that's too much for them. They call News Corp the extreme far right Murdoch propaganda machine. But every other mainstream media outlet is their editorial line is, you would say, at least centre left. So this is why.
Yeah, I'd say so now that Alan Jones is not on commercial radio, now that the Nine network owns the commercial, the traditionally conservative talk commercial radio, I know that they're pushing everybody towards the centre a little bit more. So yes, I mean, all we have is the Murdoch Press, the Australian, obviously, which is pretty centre right. It's a balanced sort of newspaper.
But they're only going to go so far. Then they're only going to stay within the realms of allowable and acceptable commentary, which is why we're doing what we're doing, because there's still a need to put other perspectives, correct a lot of the misinformation is out there. And as I said in my introduction, there needs to be a record when the history of this time is written that no, this is not how the pandemic was defeated. No, this approach was not without its costs.
Right, exactly. I hope that we continue to be able to use the platforms that enable this. That scares me, that the big tech phenomenon might start to get worse and worse and worse in terms of the censorship of non-party line information. Murdoch, we probably owe a lot to. It'll be interesting to see how the Lachlan James.
Oh, it's going to be the Lachlan Murdoch. I think News Corporation, after James has taken his turn left, it's fair to say, and yeah, the News Corporation now is significantly much smaller since they sold Sky UK and 21st Century Fox. It's not what it was.
No, it's not, and but it's still an important part of the Australian arena, and thank God we've got it, because I mean, if we didn't have, and look, Sky News Australia is only available on free-to-air in regional areas through the WIN network. So it's not something that's on the television sets of everybody in the capital city. So it's not probably having, it's really punching above its weight in terms of the influence that it is having. It's doing a fantastic job, I think, of putting the alternative view. But yes, it is left pretty much to, I think, new media and to shows like ours and platforms like ours, which seem to be growing and emerging more. And I more power to it and to all of us, I think, because it's really the consumer at the end of the day that decides what they want to listen to, what they consider to be, intelligent and have depth. And this idea, as you said before, of just, blanketing people and saying, well, they're fools or they're idiots or they're the deplorables or they're whatever, which is the tactic used by the left all the time to sort of categorize people and then they'll turn around and do the gaslighting thing of, you're creating division. boy, that's sophisticated stuff, because, no one's creating division. No one's caused this division more than the ideology of postmodernist neo-Marxism. And I think if people are not aware of what woke culture, where woke culture came from, I think it's really important to get your head across that. So grab, Douglas Murray's book is very good on explaining the background to where it all came from. It didn't just pop up overnight as some sort of nice organic outflowing of kindness and people wanting to be nice to minority groups and gay people and everything. It was that was already there. We were already on the path of reasonable, balanced acceptance of people who are different. What this thing has done is it's taken it to the next level of craziness, and it's really driving an agenda that does go back through history as a real playbook of Marxists, of communism, and of the left, and of society. The aim is to create division in society and to destroy society by pitting people against one another based on characteristics that are, ironically, sexist, racist, ageist, and discriminatory. And that's the craziness of this, or the cleverness, or the evil cleverness of it, the diabolical brilliance of it, is that the left are messing with our heads, and they're basically saying, if you're white, you're a racist now. It's like, hang on, that's racism, right?
Well, you can't have an opinion on human welfare in its entirety because you can't comment on the welfare of other races, even though we are all the human race. Yeah.
Or any man, who challenges a woman. So, Craig Kelly the other day, it was Clive Parman in there, big white guys with conservative views. There's your box, right, that they just get chucked into. But that's probably got a lot to do with why people don't like Craig Kelly, right? Because of his physicality. He's overweight. He's got that salt of the earth old Aussie, guy look about him, and he's got those views of a particular generation, I suppose. But deep down inside, he's a man who cares, right? He gives a damn, and he's probably a pretty reasonable guy. If you get to know, I don't know the guy, but I mean, I'm sure, I've met a lot of people who are like that I once would have thought, oh, well, you don't look very, sophisticated. And then you talk to them, and they're like, incredibly nice people with good values, which I'm finding more and more and more as I've shifted to, being more on the right and more conservative. It's just how nice people are, how tolerant people are, how willing to discuss things people are. Compared to my friends on the left, who half of them have completely ghosted me, and the other half who, I guess, are not so open to discuss and debate issues in some ways.
Well, I've had Craig Kelly as a guest on this program, and he's exactly how you described him. And he wants a frank and fearless discussion about the issues. He was telling me that he, like in his office, he doesn't want to be surrounded by yes men. He wants his staff to challenge him, and that's why he goes into the lion den, like the Today Show, or as he did at the beginning of 2020 on Good Morning Britain with Piers Morgan, that infamous interview over the Australian bushfires. So he's acting in the most good faith that you'd expect.
Yeah, and putting up with a lot of, crap, basically. Sometimes I look at these people in public life and you think, oh, why do they bother? The job of being an Australian politician is not exactly very appealing. It's you're opening yourself up to all sorts of attack and just unfairness, and there's no job security. You can be voted out at any minute. You got to work like a dog to win the right just to run for a seat. It's a privilege, and people do it for those reasons, and that's a lovely thing. And it's obviously it would be an honour to serve the country, but you got, as a job, you got to look at it and say, boy, there are easier ways to make, $200,000 a year probably, or just easier ways to live. Full stop. You don't have to make it.
Well, that's why it's so extraordinary that Donald Trump eventually, after many years of toying with the idea of running for president, finally did. He announced his candidacy in 2015, won the Republican nomination against all odds, won the 2016 election against all odds, ran on a bold populist platform, which was unpopular with the political establishment and mainstream media, and he was up against it for 4 years, and eventually all of them colluding together, the political establishment, mainstream media, and social media. Just look at that Time magazine article. They eventually got their man. And well, we saw that they thought that the events of January 6th, which I describe as that bizarre and surreal storming of the Capitol, I just couldn't believe that it happened. It was hardly an insurrection. Trump has now been acquitted by the Senate again, impeached twice, acquitted twice, and is now feels, I think, comfortable to speak again, because obviously he's been kicked off Twitter. He held a campaign rally in his new home state of Florida, which I think would be the best place in the world to live at the moment. Governor Ron DeSantis there is keeping the state free and open. He says we can manage the health crisis. Everyone here is an essential worker. And
Florida is the AIDS care center of the United States, right? So,
yes, the corpses should be piling up, you would think, with all those retirement villages and that, but it's not. It's not doing any worse than the lockdown states. But I'm not surprised that it's Trump's new home, given that is run out of New York. There's that joke going around that Andrew Cuomo is Florida's Realtor of the Year.
I love that. Yeah, fantastic. And I mean, look, I think also, the governor of California is Texas's Realtor of the Year.
Gruesome Newsom is his nickname.
Yeah, I think that. Sometimes I wonder, people talking about, I don't know if you saw the drum the other day. I mean, I don't watch the drum, but somebody retweeted this woman on the drum, this American woman, and this American guy was on the panel. And she was like, talking about how upsetting it was to be an American and to think that there could actually be civil war in our country and the division, and, not realizing the irony of the fact that division is all created by the ideology to which she probably subscribes. And they're all sitting around, nodding in the woke echo chamber about how appalling the deplorables must be for leading to this. The reality is that, if America was to split, I think it would split peacefully in some ways. And you do wonder whether people, to have this is the thing I often say to my left-wing friends, to have a nation. It's not about just sharing a land or sharing a continent or whatever. It's about sharing some core values and core beliefs. And neo-Marxists know that if they chip away at those core values and core beliefs, that the nation will crumble. That's how you destroy a nation. You don't have to roll the tanks in. You just chip away at the core values. And I heard Peter Credlin the other day talking about, the Australia Day issue, saying that, well, it's Australia Day now, and then next on the list is Anzac Day, right? And that's probably right. I mean, that's the way they do it. So it's, they'll get this and then they'll go for the next thing. And it's not everybody on the left that I'm talking about. It's it's the extreme neo-Marxist people. But it's those extremes of politics that drive a lot of that thinking that eventually leaks through to the center. And it's quite manipulative and clever and in a diabolical kind of way. Conservative values, which really are just about individual freedom, respect for the individual over the state, respect for the individual over the collective, and respect for family as the primary social structure of a society and a nation, rather than government being the primary institution. those principles and those values and the principles of free market liberalism and property ownership rights and all of those things upon which our culture and society have been built, most people are not aware of that stuff. I mean, most kids today are not aware that that's what our culture is and where it came from, and it didn't just pop up overnight. And I think that's a problem, because that's being exploited by this new culture, which is saying that, there was nothing good about the colonial era. It was all bad. Well, there were bad things that happened in the colonial era, but you've got to also consider the evolution of the planet, right? I mean, the world and social structures. I mean, Australia was never going to remain at the terrain of a number of different small Aboriginal nations. And it didn't start that way either, right? So, it's things evolve, things change, and yes, there is conflict and there are injustices throughout history, but you can't look at our society and say, well, it's all evil. And that's essentially where we're at with what's being proposed to be taught in schools in the West.
Yes,
that our own culture is just not worth anything, and it's all bad. It's all evil and racist and sexist and horrible. Now that's where I get a little bit depressed, Tim, is that's not a sustainable position. So it's something's going to have to give, because if that does become the dominant thinking and we do allow this, then our nation will crack, because it doesn't have core values uniting it. Now, I guess coming back to the America thing we were talking about, should America perhaps, break up along values lines?
Well, look at Yugoslavia. They were, genociding themselves in the 90s. They were manipulated very well under Tito, the communist dictator, for many years, but they all went their separate ways. Serbia, Croatia, Montenegro, Bosnia, and they're all happy now.
Yeah, very distinct, different cultures, and Balkanization is the word that we get from the Balkan states. So, I think maybe that's where the United States is heading, because if we do have a situation where, and apparently we're getting quite close to it, if you look at the numbers, where the Democrats might be able to create the Californication of the whole country. In other words, a situation where they could never lose an election, really, because they just have such a strong and overwhelming majority and level of support, because it's embedded. I mean, there's a number of ways that they try, they might do that, adding 2 states, giving them 4 more seats in the, sorry, I'm thinking about Australia. It's 4 more seats, sorry, in the Senate. If they have Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. become states, the 51st and 52nd state. And if they do that, and then if they increase the Supreme Court numbers and bring that up to a level that they can get sort of their political ideology as a majority in there, even though it's supposed to not be a factor.
I don't think the Supreme Court, despite the fact that Trump appointed 3 justices, they seem to roll over to the political will of the administration of the day pretty quickly.
I think they do. I'd like to be somewhat optimistic and say that they're just doing their job, sticking to their knitting and doing what they're supposed to do, which is not be politically persuaded and just look at the rule of the law. But then, of course,
but what I'm saying is that they, even if it is a rule of law issue, they don't want to, say, invalidate a huge government policy like they didn't do with Obamacare. Right.
So, yeah. And I think, I've got other issues about, how much power the Supreme Court should have, and really in a democracy and a republic. But I think, I think that if we get to a situation where the Democrats have kind of got that absolute control, or they feel like they've got that absolute control, that then, something will have to give, because there's going to be a lot of unhappy people, and maybe the only safe, peaceful answer is to, perhaps have a demarcation, a political demarcation, and just have kind of a looser alliance for defense and things like that between these 2 separate kinds of United States. But it'd be very sad to see. But when you've got a culture that's as divided as it is, it's hard to see how it could venture otherwise. Of course, if California had to go it alone and didn't have Texas, then you would probably see a pretty quick shift in the fates of those two states, where you'd see liberal free market economics driving one and propelling one to great wealth, and socialist policies and big government, big state control stuff driving the other into the ground. That'd be interesting to see and watch.
I just want to finish off now with the future of alternative media, because obviously the golden era of the internet looks to be coming to a close. YouTube is becoming less about you, the content creator, and it's becoming more corporate tube. And we've also, as we saw with the final days of Trump's Twitter account, but it was basically becoming a publisher, adding its own editorial notes on a lot of his and his supporters' tweets. Facebook in some articles I see about 6 fact checks, and this is the next obstacle. And we saw what happened with Parler after January 6th. It's up to date, but it's got a significantly diluted free speech policy now, and it's very buggy. I still think that probably Gab and Telegram are the best alternate social media websites, but obviously video hosting is the most technologically complicated one. There's a few that are doing okay, such as BitChute, but doesn't have live streaming. DLive, which we're on at the moment, does live streaming, but that still has terms of service. So the those who are wanting to control the narrative, the messaging, they're always on our tails, and so there's always it can always technology can keep evolving to maximize freedom and exchange of information. Bitcoin has helped the people deplatform by payment processes, but it's a never-ending battle to stay ahead of them.
Yeah, it is. And look, I think you said it there. It's a never-ending battle. These are the forces of our planet, right? It seems at the moment, people often say to me, "Oh, the divide between left and right is so sad, and it's getting much worse." And we need to listen to each other. We need to be attempting more unity. But you've got two diametrically opposed ideologies, and I don't know that they can coexist peacefully. I think that you've probably got to have that demarcation happen. I don't like wars, so a little bit of negotiating that we perhaps go separate ways. Because I think what will happen at the end of the day is that liberal free market economies will boom, as I said, and the socialist ones will go to ground, which is exactly what happened in the 20th century. But obviously we missed the lesson, so we've got to go through it all again, have we? But fair enough, if that's what you want to do, you can go through it, but you're not taking me with you. That's my view. So I think we've just got to all be kind of very strong in demanding what we want. It just never ends. It's an endless battle, as you say, and we've got to keep up the fight. And that's why I say 2021 has to be the year of the quiet Australian becomes the loud Australian. I have respect for those people who are in a position where they can't speak out as freely as someone like I can, but I would encourage anybody who is, an old fuddy-duddy and mature and maybe retired or semi-retired to kind of do your bit for the country and speak out a lot louder now and just say, look, enough is enough. We've just got to keep pushing back. But we're never going to get rid of the woke crowd. They're always going to be there. We just have to reset the agenda and not let it, as we have done for the last 40 years, let it become the dominant cultural thing. Which, just before we do finish, Tim, I want to make this point very strongly. Politics is downstream of culture. Andrew Breitbart said that. And Andrew Breitbart, love him or hate him, another person that's sort of just boxed into a thing. If you read his book, he's actually quite an interesting guy, and he went from the left to the right himself. And it's an interesting journey and story, but very brilliant in terms of media. And he said quite clearly that, politics is downstream of culture, which means simply that it's no good standing at the ballot box handing out how to vote cards, asking people to vote for you, for your Conservative Party, if you've lost the entire culture war. And I was disturbed as anything, more than anything I've heard, when I heard Scott Morrison on 3AW tell Neil Mitchell last week that he wasn't concerned about woke culture. And he actually said to Neil that he was more concerned about the practical things like jobs and keeping the country healthy. Well, you can't keep the country healthy, and you can't keep jobs if you're going to permit a neo-Marxist identity politics-based, postmodernist, whatever the heck you want to call it.
I mean, look at how he just decided to give up on the Israel Folau issue. He just said that issue has had enough oxygen, even though in the past he defended Israel Folau's right to free speech and called him a nice guy.
Yeah. So I think that's what we've got to start to do. We've got to start to continue. Well, we've got to continue to do. I think we're doing okay. We're getting there, and we're winning the culture wars more and more and more. We've got to get more united. We've got to get more organised. We've got to get ourselves a political party that we can all sort of get behind, rather than having 7 different conservative political parties trying to create something. We've got to try and be heard much more and shift that culture. Now, the first thing that they should be doing, that ScoMo should have done the minute he got elected, because I went through that campaign. I campaigned online a lot for ScoMo, and I watched the whole thing from overseas. And I was, just as an Australian, I was just tapping away. I wasn't being paid by anybody to campaign officially or anything, but I just had my little Twitter account and my big brain of opinions and my loud mouth. And I just, I thought, this is really hard, because we're fighting up against this massive $1 billion entity that's basically a giant propaganda machine for centre, left, and left thinking. And so, it's tough to fight against that if you're going to every election with one arm tied behind your back. So, having won that election, I thought the first thing that they would do was hit the culture war, and the culture war is the ABC and our education system, and the universities and our schools. We might never get into. They might never win again if they don't get in and start to really shift these things. So I think we have to start. If you're on conservative politics, if you are a supporter of the traditional parties, the Liberal Party or the National Party, I think you've got to start picking up the phone and calling your members, or getting involved at a branch level and saying, "Listen, guys, this needs to happen. We have to focus on the culture war, and we have to demand that our politicians and representatives do that. Because if we don't, it'll be game over, and we'll be facing the kind of problems that the Republicans are facing at the moment in the United States."
And as you were both discussing before, Scott Morrison, any centre-right leader needs to actually lead, not just be passive, just trying to do enough not to offend anybody, get enough positive PR to win the next election.
Yeah, that's right. It's leadership, not management. You can't just be managing based on market research. You've got to lead. You've got to create a vision, right? And sell the vision. And the vision ought to be in Australia that's far more respectful of its heritage, of the Western philosophical and Judeo-Christian sort of background of the country. We've got to be respectful of that. Yes, we should respect Indigenous culture. It's rich and really fascinating and interesting and wonderful culture. But this whole idea of victimhood and blame and white guilt, and I mean, that is just absolute garbage. And we have to call it out and stomp it out. It cannot continue. As I say, if it continues, we won't have a nation. I really believe that. It's not a question of just, it's going to be unpleasant. It actually will be the end of us, in my view. So, sorry for being so pessimistic, but I think we can win.
Well, it just shows the task ahead to, well, not just there's an economy to rebuild, a culture to rebuild, and also now freedom to rebuild. And well, I hope you get the freedom to go back home soon. I've appreciated you coming on tonight, and I would encourage everybody to either listen or watch to your podcast, because it is, I would say, a very well put together summary of not just what's in the news, but what it means. So where's the best place for people to access your weekly podcast?
Thank you, Tim. Appreciate that. I was watching it tonight thinking it's not an easy we do cover a lot of information, so it's kind of might be the sort of podcast you want to pause and listen to in sections or whatever. But basically,
it's perfect for somebody like me. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of if you're really, it's a good one to listen to with the earpods and stuff, because you kind of, when you're on your own, it's not good family viewing. It's a collective, I don't think, because you've got to really pay attention. I break all the rules of TV and radio that I was taught, that you don't overload people with too much info. But look, it's just important. It's important stuff. I try to cover what's important. So this week we take a deep dive on how vaccines actually work. I want to know and understand how they work. I don't really know that much about them.
Yeah, because we still don't know. We didn't get a chance to touch on it, but we still don't know if these vaccines will prevent transmission, which is the big thing that we need, at least in Australia, to get us out of this rut.
Yeah, it will build herd immunity eventually, and that will sort of cause will fix the transmission thing. But it's this mRNA vaccines are all new, right? It's a totally new kind of vaccine,
which is the Pfizer vaccine.
Well, they both. I think the AstraZeneca one, they're all mRNA based. There are a few ones coming out that are more like traditional vaccines. But I didn't even understand what that was, or what so this is what I try to do. I just try to get stuff that we're not getting on the media, that we should be in the mainstream media, and just sort of put it out there and say, okay, you're going to have to put your thinking hat on here for a few minutes. But I found the simplest explanations I can find on YouTube. Here's some clips from other smart people, people smarter than me that know what they're talking about. Let's see if we can understand it together. So, and then you can make an informed decision then about the risks of vaccines, because vaccines have risks, of course. That's the sort of thing we're trying to do. Put out the numbers. I always try to go to the numbers, remind people of how many cases we've got, remind people of where things are at. Then just look at other people's commentary that's really good and interesting, and put little bits of it in. So it usually runs about 45 to an hour. It's a good listen. If you want to listen on, you can get it on Apple or Spotify or any of the major podcast platforms, and subscribe there for us. If you want to watch, we've been video since episode 20, thanks to Matthew Wong and the Discernible platform, which are now co-producing the show with me. We're sort of part of Discernible now. So Discernible is discernible, ABLE, .io, which is a rather unusual suffix. But that's what it is. So it's www.discernible.io, and you'll see there you get all of our videos. Also on the Good Sauce platform, SAUCE, which is Dave Pello's platform, another one with a lot of good shows on it, and also YouTube, Facebook channels of Good Sauce, of Discernible, and we also have our own Facebook and YouTube channels. So just the Otherside Australia, you have to put the Australia in, or you'll get a couple of songs by from various artists. One of them from The Greatest Showman, I think. So the Otherside Australia, but best to subscribe on the Discernible platform, because we're merging with Discernible, so it will be all one platform soon. So check us out there.
And people can also follow you on Twitter, which is another lion's den. You're a bit like Alexandra Marshall, who I've had on this program, who's been a contributor to your show, Ali Melly. I've asked her the question, why do you do it? And well, you've answered it, because it is one of the biggest information platforms out there, so it needs a counter, but you certainly deal with a lot there.
Well, I don't want to be talking. Look, I'm an old guy. I'm a big guy. I'm tough. I can handle it. I don't really care. There's not much that a 25-year-old woke kid can say that would upset me. this is part of what I was talking about. You know, you got to go into the lion's den. It's no good us sitting around as sort of people on the centre right and right, talking to ourselves. I mean, we've got to go into the centre left at least, and try to change minds and wait, explain to kids where we're coming from. And that's something I think, you've got to get into these platforms that are dominated by the left. On Twitter, I just advise people to go in there and challenge the assumptions of the left. I mean, that they're the good guys and we're the bad guys, right? The whole idea that they look after poor people and that's all wrong. If you look at the research, free market liberalism has done more for the poor, getting people out of poverty, than any other system on earth. And socialism has just led to destruction. And I just think the kids we tell that, well, they're going to wake up.
And it's not so much to convince the person you're replying to, it's more just the person who's observing, who's open to be persuaded, because those hardcore blue drops, so right. they're not going to change their minds.
No, you're not. That's absolutely right. I mean, I've even had discussions and debates with people where, they say, go away, or you're never going to change my mind. And I reply, well, I'm actually not trying to change your mind, because there's no way anybody's going to change your mind for a long time. But I want people who are reading this conversation and reading your tweets to understand that there's another side, and I might change their minds. So just get out there, just pump it out, right? Just put your arguments, put them in a kind-hearted way that confounds people who assume that everybody that's conservative is some sort of horrible, evil, greedy monster. Explain, how, and just keep there's a lot of great resources out there. Dave Rubin and Mark Levin and, Steven Pinker's books about how liberal, free markets have raised people out of poverty. There's fee.org, FEE.org, for good economics papers and short things that you can link to. So just get into that stuff and just pump it. Do what they do. The truth will win out at the end of the day. We're on the right side. We're on the side that actually has evidence, and we're not on the side that led to the deaths of 100 million people at the hands of their own governments in the 20th century. So we should be able to win this thing.
Yeah, exactly. Although it can take, as we saw with communism in Eastern Europe, quite a number of years. It's a hard slog, but that's sometimes what it takes to achieve the appropriate free society, which is what leads to human flourishing. Thank you again, Damien. As you said, 2021, important year. We'll both be watching it closely, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Great talking to you. Really enjoyed it. Hope to see you again.
Cheers. Good night.
Good night.
And that's WilmsFront for this week. As I stated, I'll be back next Wednesday night, 8:30 p.m. Melbourne time, on the WilmsFront YouTube and D Live with Joel Jamal as my guest. Tomorrow night, 8:30 p.m. Melbourne time, 7:30 p.m. Brisbane time, on the Unshackled's YouTube channel. I'm on the Dusty Bogan's Thirsty Thursday panel. That concludes the Unshackled productions for the week. Of course, keep checking out the unshackled.net for our Unshackled Productions archive and also our articles. You can also, if you don't want to send through a super chat, you can also send through a direct donation, the unshackled.net/donate, or sign up for a regular membership, the unshackled.net/membership. And I'll be back, of course, next week as well for the Brawler and the Brain, 8:30 p.m. Melbourne time, on the Unshackled YouTube channel, hosted by myself and Jared Searby. And then on Tuesday is Trad Tasman Talk, 7 p.m. Melbourne time, with myself and Dewey DeBoer, where we're just a couple of hours away from getting out of home prison again. So hopefully myself and Dewey will be a bit more optimistic next week, but who knows? This is the uncertain 2021. So everyone, my message is stay positive, stay hopeful, and make sure that you make your voice heard on whatever platform that you're choosing to operate on, because there needs to be voices against the current narrative. That's the message of this episode tonight. And as I said, I'll see you all tomorrow night for Dusty Bogan's Thirsty Thursday. Enjoy the rest of your night, and I'll see you again soon.
Thanks for tuning in to WilmsFront. Visit timwilms.com or Rational Rise TV to view the archive of episodes. And keep visiting the Unshackled.net to view all our shows and to keep up with the latest real news and analysis.